Daniel,
Ouais.
c'est bon, j'ai pu importer incluant l'agenda et l'agenda, mais quand je clique sur slide, je ne vois pas.
Ah, alors attends, je regarde. Effectivement, moi non plus, je ne le vois pas. Est-ce qu'il y a un moyen de partager le bureau avec ça?
Je crois que si tu fais...
Non.
Ah non, c'est bon, je vois. C'est-à-dire que tu dois cliquer sur Share Preloaded Slide.
D'accord.
Tu veux que je lance en premier?
Ouais, vas-y, occupe-toi de ça.
Okay.
Si tu as trouvé le moyen, c'est bon.
C'est bon, tu veux commencer, lancer la session?
Ouais, vas-y, tu présentes, je fais juste le status en fait.
Okay. Hello, can you all hear me? So we're going to start. Thank you for making the time to attend our ACE working group session. So as a gentle reminder, here's the note well. Here are the different meeting tips for those who are remote as well. Okay, here's the agenda for today. First is going to be the chair status. Second item on the agenda is draft key group com, key group com OS core. And third is the pub/sub profile, including revoke token notification. So I'll hand over to Daniel.
Yeah, so let's check the status where we are. So first of all, we would like to thank Ben, and after the status, I will give you I will give him the mic, so he can think about what he's going to say while I'm presenting the status. He won't be upset. So I think we would like to thank you for all the follow-up and the work you did. Let's see where we are now. So we have a bunch of RFCs in the queue. So we have recently the IETF, we have the CoAP East, DTLS authorized, OAuth params, OS core profile. So it's unclear to me when they're going to be published, but I hope the internet is not going to collapse because everyone is waiting for those to be published. We have a few other documents that are AD revision. So I'm thinking of the CMPv2, the MQTT, and the key group com. So I don't exactly know how this is going to be handled. Are you gonna? I mean, do you think, Ben, you will be able to send them to publication, or will they be handled by Paul or Raman? That might be some of the question we have. And we do have some drafts that are in various stages of the working group last call. So we had a problem with the CoAP EP that has not been sent to the ISG, but that's going to be fixed tomorrow. We just lately realized that when we sent it, we had an issue with the shepherd that prevent it to be sent, but it's really fixable. It's just that we realized that too late. There is the extended DTLS authorized, so it's also waiting for shepherd. If anyone is willing to volunteer, I mean, it's more than welcome. And we have the key group Como score, which is receiving some comments. So it's a long working group last code process, but maybe Marco is going to say a few words on that. Now, where the working group is heading is we have three documents. The PubSub profile. It's unclear if Sigdem is online and maybe she wants to add something, but I mean, there are still some point to be addressed in that document. And we have two drafts that are new or not so new in that working group. So, and these are going to be presented this time. My question for, I mean, it's more than one co-author. So is that, do we think that we can ship those drafts to the IHG by July? And that's all. So maybe I can give the mic to Ben, and if anyone has anything. So, oh, I see Francesca in the line. Please go ahead.
Hi. No, just about the agenda. We didn't do agenda bashing, but as one of the co-authors of the PubSub profile, I don't think it should be on the agenda. Sigdem is not here. She's not in the meeting. And there was no update for this meeting.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Okay, so, okay, yeah. The current agenda is on the edge, and I've removed that one. No problem.
Okay.
Anyone in the queue? No?
No.
Ben?
Okay, great. Yeah, so it's been a fun time working through all of this stuff the past few years. That was a good reminder about the status of some of the outstanding documents. I think the CMPv2 co-op transport is probably not going to get approved in the next day. But I will definitely take a look at the co-op East, and I think the MQTT profile I'm going to try real hard to get sent to the RFC editor before things hand off. I know that Sigdem posted an update, and I've been asking the remaining two discuss holders to take a look and hopefully clear, and then I'll review the diff myself before sending it off. But that's probably the main changes from the current state that I expect before my term fully expires. We do have the sort of core 4 documents in the RFC editor as well, but I think there's still a couple of final edits to make things consistent across the cluster of documents that we want to do. So we're going to try and not rush those out, is my sense. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. One thing I'd like also to confirm is that I see Göran editing, taking notes, but I'm just wondering if anyone can help him for the minutes. Anyone can help?
Sorry, yeah, I will do it, Paul Vargas.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Okay, good. So let's move on to the agenda. Key group com. Oh, maybe just a question, Paul. Are you going to be our AD or for ACE, or it is not discussed?
Yes, I will be.
Okay, right.
I guess one question while I'm still up. Are you intending to be sharing the slides right now? I'm not seeing them come through. I'm not sure if they're showing up in the room or not.
So I think we're waiting for Marco.
Hi, Daniel. So ASCII Group Com, I think, shouldn't be in the agenda actually because it's under AD review right now. I have no updates on that since last time though. And
Yeah, it's the GroupCom OS core, I think, on the agenda.
right, that's on the agenda. So I think you should share the slides through Meet Echo.
Okay.
Right. I'm on site, by the way, so.
I can see you. So let me check.
Preload slides. Share
So
preloaded slides.
Okay, so you're doing it, Logan. Good.
Great. Thank you. Yes, this is a short update for the latest revision of KeyGroup score. Next slide, please. Yeah, most of the updates of this round were editorial or editorial plus, actually, as triggered by changes done in the group score document in core. And just to mention the main ones, some functionalities at the group manager were declared as optional. So this is now also reflected here. And it was agreed to have a clear-cut distinction between the concepts of public key and authentication credential. That is also reflected here, together with renaming some related parameters and rephrasing text around them. And about this, I think I took care of all the parameters actually defined in this document. But this document is also inheriting some parameters about these aspects from ASCII Group Com that I prefer not to touch since it is under AD review and didn't want to generate even more confusion. So when it is about addressing parameters and so on related to public key and authentication credential, anything that started in ASCII Group Com and was inherited here is untouched for now. And my plan is for when addressing the AD review for ASCII Group Com, taking care of those in that document and in this one. All right. Next slide,
So just
please.
a clarification. Do you it's unclear to me if you intend to change the key group com document.
There will be changes to do about this,
Okay.
about parameter names. It's nothing functional. It's editorial plus, I'd like to think. But yeah, it's a matter of consistency with, well, the group score document in core to start with. And
Okay,
I
good.
plan to do that as part of the AD review processing when it comes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, next slide, please. Right, it was also an opportunity to do some fix and update in the IANA registrations about the integer register to declare explicitly the format of scope used here, and also following the last call reviews and other reviews for the AIF document now approved, I also make related registrations more consistent. And I noticed once this document was already submitted that some text about AIF again has to be improved here to be aligned with what was agreed after some last call comments on AIF as well. So what you see at the end of this slide is actually what's left to do as related to AIF that I plan to take at the next revision. Next slide, please. Yeah, so that was the status for this revision, which is aligned, by the way, functionally, which is the most important thing to the group score document in core. The document is formally under working group last call, and we got a review from Joran. Thank you very much for that. As far as understood, is the first part of the review, actually, which is mostly about trying to enforce a new structure of the content in the document. And based on this new structure, when enforced, I understand more comments on the actual content will come back. So my plan is, of course, to start working on this restructuring first part as soon as possible. For convenience, I suppose it's just better to submit a new version and then the work can continue there on applying actual comments. And right, I mentioned already the syncing that will be required with ASCII Group Com about the spending parameters when the AD review comes from ASCII Group Com. And I also got some comments from Francesca as core AD about syncing the request for publications from document in ACE and core around this topic. So it'd be good and convenient for the ISG to receive together 3 documents. This one we are discussing here, and 2 documents in core mentioned here, one of which is approaching working group last call. The other one has finished it and should soon go to Shepherd write-up. And yeah, overall changes can still come up and needed to be done. I hope not fundamental as this cluster of document moves forward. I think that's just unavoidable and we have to live with that, but it's fine. Yeah, and that would be it from my side.
Okay, good. Any questions? No. So next presentation.
That should be GM admin. Right, thank you. And we are on version 5 with this one. It was a pretty big update, I would say. Next slide, please. So to recap, the goal of this document is to define a RESTful interface at the OSCORP Group Manager, but intended for ACE clients acting as administrators. So they're supposed to create, configure, delete OSCORP groups at that Group Manager. Next slide, please. It's even clearer how admin resources are organized at the Group Manager here. So you're supposed to have a single group collection resource as a main entry point for an administrator, and operations at that resource allows the administrator to retrieve the list of existing groups, possibly verifying grained or partially using fetch rather than get, or creating a new group through a post request. And the result of that is practically creating a child resource or group configuration resource, which is storing the actual parameters of different kind composing the current configuration of the OSCORP group. But then in turn, the administrator can interact precisely with one of those group configuration resources for the sake of retrieving the current configuration of that group entirely or partially, override it entirely or update it selectively, or delete it, meaning deleting the group. Next slide, please. So we made a couple of changes, starting with, was anyone talking? No, my impression. Some changes were very similar to those I mentioned for the previous document, about changing some parameter names and phrasing, about distinguishing between public key and authentication credential, but again, editorial plus. We tried to simplify it a little bit in the processing of creating a new group from the administrator. It is still possible for the administrator, when creating a new group, to suggest a name to assign to that group, to the group manager, and the group manager still has the final word about the exact group name to assign to that group. That has to be available first of all, and fine for whatever reason to the group manager. So what we had before was that this suggestion from the administrator was entirely optional, but that complicates pretty much the design space for the design of the scope format that I'll introduce later on. So we prefer to relax this little detail, and it should still be fine, we believe, because there's still a lot of flexibility, and it still leaves the final decision to the group manager, which is the most important thing anyway. So it's a relatively minor update, but still just to be well understood. Okay, next slide, please.
But just a question. The name is actually only useful for the group manager.
Sorry, say it again. Use for
The group name.
It's just an identifier that the administrator can refer to later on. Yeah, it has no cryptographic meaning. No, it's just a label. Okay. So Can you move to the next slide? I think we were there. Yeah, right. We were under specifying how exactly the group manager informs the group member right after having updated the configuration of the group. Now we are more specific with that, and we are trying to reuse as much as possible content format, message format, and so on from KeyGroupCom OSCORE, which is pretty nice. And then we had in mind the possible addition that we haven't added yet. I really just prefer to confirm with the group first if there are any objections. As I mentioned before, in recent changes in the core document, we have made optional for the group manager to support, among other things, the recycling of group identifiers in the group. So if the group manager is actually able to do that, it would be convenient too, to extend the lifetime of the group forever in principle. So it makes sense here, I think, to have the administrator creating the group explicitly choosing if this has to happen or not, of course, providing that the group manager is supporting this feature in the first place. And this would be pretty cheap and easy to do. It's just about adding one more parameter in the group creation request that the administrator can set to true or false. And if it is true and the group manager does support this feature, this will actually happen. So I couldn't think of anything really bad or controversial here, but before moving on adding this little thing, just wanted to be sure it's fine. Is there any objection? Heard none. So, well, I'll give it a try and add it. It's relatively simple, and then it's probably even easier to review on text having this. Okay, next slide, please. Right, this is the bigger change instead that we have postponed for a long time, and finally we've made it. And it started a long time ago, because so far we were not specifying the exact format that scope should have in a token request response and in the actual access token. It started with all input from Jim Shad and Christian Amsus. Jim Shad on his side imagined a workflow where the administrator obtains the first token, posts it, and building on the granted operations and can perform, it actually creates two groups, G1, G2, does something with those. Okay, that token eventually expires, and the administrator requests for a new access token and posts it, but that will practically result in establishing a new secure association and secure identity for that administrator, and basically the group manager cannot recognize that administrator as exactly the previous one anymore. And this can be a complication because we would like that administrator to continue doing some things in the groups it created them itself before, but at the same time without having to touch access policies at the authorization server anymore. So this was just something nice to be able to achieve somehow, building the scope in a convenient way. If you move to the next slide, please, then we also have the input from Christian that at some point, of course, noted you're really focusing on one single administrator doing potentially everything. It would be good to have beside that also a different class of administrators, like able to do at least something on groups that they didn't create themselves, but created by some other, say, main administrator. So putting all this together and having further discussion also with the proponents and the co-authors, we started to sketch a possible format of scope. We had placeholder text about that in the previous version of the draft. And now we have a full first definition of this in this revision instead, that I can show you in the next slides. Can you move to the next slide, please? Thanks. Since we are going to use AIF, of course, we didn't have to start from scratch, and we thought of evolving the AIF data model that we are using, first of all, in the KeyGroupCom OSCORE document presented before. If you remember, there we also defined scope based on AIF, where scope is a set of scope entries, and every entry specifies as a TOID an exact group name, and there the group names come again, by the way, and STPerm the exact roles that the client owning the token can have in that group. So that's what happens in that document, but we can do something kind of similar in our case for the administrator now. Next slide, please. Yeah, still using AIF, we basically defined a new AIF data model for administrators, which has a fundamental difference. TOID here is not an exact group name. It's rather a pattern of group names. And tperm is, again, an integer to be read as a bitmap encoding the permissions that an administrator has on any group whose name matches with that corresponding pattern. Of course, a set of permissions. This is not really like the roles of a member. We thought of permissions that can be mapped to the operation that we have defined on the interface for administrator. So retrieving list of groups, creating, reading configuration, updating configuration, deleting the group. And this should address both original input from Jim and Christian. Jim's because it thinks in terms of patterns of name, not exact names anymore. So it's friendly with an administrator asking for a new token following the expiration of the first one. And it also addresses Christian points, we think, because basically a non-main administrator can just be granted a token with a more restrictive name pattern and with less permissions than the original main admin. If you move to the next slide, that really summarizes making a parallel with the format used in KeyGroupCom OSCORE instead. So again, scope would be a collection of scope entries where each has a pair name pattern and integer encoding the granted permissions to an administrator for any group whose name matches that pattern. First of all, any overall comment on this direction, use of AIF?
So maybe I have more than a comment. It's just a question. I see that we're using the name of the group as not only a property for a specific group, but it has some implications on access and things like that. So I was wondering if the group can have an ID, which is a random number, for example, and that the name is actually one property is associated to that ID, instead of then having, I'm just wondering if that's something that would be feasible or not feasible in our case.
I think it is feasible and can boil down to an implementation detail on the group manager and how it generates names. But this started already with KeyGroupCom OSCORE, where names are used already. So groups are identified by a text string name already included in tokens for group members. So this just builds on that thinking on the first step when the administrator creates the group. You may, as a group manager, generate a random number if you want and express that as a text string, and that's your name. Sure, that's really about local preferences for the group manager, and you can do that. But it feels more friendly to have the name ultimately expressed as a text string, I think.
Yeah, no, I mean, Ben is in the queue. Yeah, please go ahead, Ben.
Go ahead and finish your question, Daniel.
No, so what I was suggesting is that when I say a random number, it's an ID that has no meaning as opposed to a text string, and then we attach to that. As I'm saying random, but I should say opaque. It's more opaque. Is more maybe something like an opaque identity. And then you assign to that identity a name that you can change. It's only one properties. That was what I was suggesting.
So changing it would be a problem. It's in fact something to be decided once and for all, and living with that group all along. It's not exactly opaque right now. If you mean it doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to have any English meaning, yeah, you can have random characters there, but it's something that all the parties involved have to understand here for the sake of group discovery, if you want to, and token request.
Yeah, so I guess that's to me. I was just going to say that, you know, naming entities is one of the classic challenging problems in computer science, and it's obviously going to be important for us to be able to use some of the structure of the names as we represent permissions and like the wildcarding of the names to help us make our representation of the permissions more efficiently encodable. But it seems like because we're going to be using the structure of the names in the access model, we should be very clear when we first introduce the concept of the group names that the names do have an internal structure, and try to be as clear as we can about the form of that structure so that it's sort of intrinsic into the concept of the group name, and we're not trying to retrofit the structure on just in order to apply the permissions to it. It should really be built in from the start.
Thanks. Yeah, and of course, we really want to hook this into AIF, where, well, QID is supposed to be a text string. So everything fit naturally. Already when working on key group on Oscar, I would say where that started. So in this respect about the exact group name thing, we are not adding anything new here. Here, the shift is thinking more in terms of patterns of names because we have a different problem. But okay, thanks for the feedback. Yeah, if you can move to the next slide, please. Yeah, after having defined all this, of course, we realized, and then there are some practical actions to take as some of the actors involved. So of course, the resource server has to store that access token and be sure when receiving a request to one of those admin resources that there is an access token, first of all, and the scope in it has at least one scope entry granting that exact permission on that for that group name if matching with at least one pattern. Details can change depending on the exact request on the exact resource. So we added for each resource handler an exact list of steps to take to perform this access control checks. To our surprise, we found out it's a bit more complicated to describe well on the authorization server, actually, when the client requests an access token. So it requests for a certain scope, and at a high level, the authorization server has to compare that scope against what can be granted to that client based on the pre-installed access policies. To be better safe than sorry, I think we got a bit carried away and find a judgment procedure at the authorization server pretty much in detail, probably too much. So as a next step for the next revision, I think you'd be better in retrospective to have such a detailed procedure as a text for an appendix as an example of how the authorization server can especially perform those checks and take those decisions, while we can reduce a lot the content in that section of the document body, just saying that, well, the authorization server has to take a decision comparing the request against the access policies, as usual. Any particular objection in making this, well, all in all, editorial improvement, but I think significant. Here, none, so I'll give it a try. Next slide, please. And we're getting to the end, I believe. Yeah, this is something to think through. I think it's a possible nice optimization. There may be cases where the same ACE client is supposed to be both administrator for some groups and member of some other groups at the same group manager. But still, then we would really like to have only one access token involved with one pop key and so on. So ideally, it would be good to have a single access token with scope containing a mix of scope entries for members and of scope entries for administrators. And we think this is really easy to achieve, actually. Thinking of the way we have especially encoded the permission part, tperm. So if you remember in the AF data model from ASCII group common score for group members, in every scope entry, tperm has the least significant bit reserved and always set to 0. Well, it's exactly the opposite in the scope entries for administrators, where the last bit of tperm is always set to 1, meaning that still with the name pattern playing a big role, every administrator has basically the permission to retrieve the list of existing groups. So if you build this bag of scope entries of different types within the same scope, you are able to trivially distinguish those just by looking at the last bit of tperm. So we were thinking to introduce this possibility, of course, which is just a plus, unless there are particular objections or controversies anyone sees. Here, none either.
What is actually the advantage of because it seems to me that we're trying to mix some rules, different rules, and I'm just wondering if it's going to help or introduce some.
It helps because you can stick to one access token only, and typically a resource server is supposed to keep only one access token per pop key per client, and you'd be able to comply with this requirement here, keeping one access token for the same as client. I don't see any particular problem because the different scope entries are really distinct and distinguishable, and all in all, the group name or the pattern name matters, and you know which type every scope entry is exactly because of that bit. So I don't see any source of confusion in trying to process this this collection of different types of scope entries, and it's only these 2 types, of course. But the advantage is that you can stick to one access token only. So if there are no objections, I think to add this part too and see where it goes.
So basically, as a user or anything I'm going to do, I'm going to consider the union of the.
No, as an admin, what matters to you are the entries where the last bit of tperm ends with 1, which classifies them as admin entries, and you can do what tperm tells you for the corresponding TOID entry or part of that scope entry. So you will have some permission for all the groups whose name matches the corresponding name pattern, and the same for another admin scope entry, and so on. But then you may have together in the same scope also some member scope entries. And then things work just like in ASCII group common score, nothing new to define here. So what would be new to define here is how you make practically the 2 types of scope entries coexist. And bottom line, the trick is looking at that least significant bit. Then you just follow their individual semantics. I see Joran in the queue.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask another question, but let me start with this one. So this bit is only just it's just like an keeping track of things. It doesn't have any meaning. It's not like you get any other privileges, or it's just a way of displaying where keeping different the permissions for users and for admin.
Well, it has a meaning. We can use it to distinguish between the 2 types of scope entries as a lucky byproduct, but otherwise it has a meaning. In the green box, it's basically allowing the administrator to perform the action. Yes, the thing is, it's always set to 1 for every administrator for which this scope entry is released.
Right, you forgot about that. Okay, so it's the admin is sort of signifying the admin rights in some sense.
Yes. For the blue case, well, if you want to, it also has a meaning, but it was defined as reserved and set to 0. So it's a non-meaning, but still they have a meaning. First of all, it's just that we were lucky to notice, oh, they can be used to distinguish which is which.
Yeah. Okay. I'll come back with the other question.
Thank you. Yeah, this is just a summary of the updates I've gone through, and the plan for the next revision is to address those open points that I raise and come with good text about them, hopefully. And until then, comments, reviews are very welcome from the group.
Okay, maybe then I should take my question. So, sorry, something. We have in ACE-Key GroupCom, there is a section looking at operations supported by clients. What is expected by a client to minimally support, to give a hint at sort of what is the bare minimum that you need to implement. Is there similar? Sorry.
Yes, maybe something similar can be thought here. So in that document, clients were exactly group members only. This is intended for administrator. I expect an administrator to be able very minimally to create a group. I mean, very minimally.
Yeah.
But makes sense to also expect capability to update the configuration and delete the group. But we can start thinking about presenting these capabilities under that framework too.
I think, I mean, it could be scary if you open the document and you see all these properties and it sort of adds up. But if you get an understanding that this is what you minimally need to support, and then I can build from that, that could be more inviting, I think.
I agree. Minimally the group creation.
Yeah, that sounds reasonable. But I'm on sort of basically express in terms of which are the admin operations and so on. Yeah, that was my comment.
Thank you, Göran.
Thank you.
Okay, I guess I am next in the queue. So to sort of synthesize Daniel's comment from earlier and thinking about the use of AIF. So like we've got these group names and they sort of have to exist in a human readable form because the administrator is going to be using them. And the administrator is often a human. But we could certainly imagine an approach where the sort of underlying authoritative ID is something else, maybe a random number, maybe some object with a CBOR structure, and that the name is an attribute bound to it. And when we go and we look at the authorization information, we talk about this random ID or other CBOR structure, and the name is only used for the human readable bits. And so it turns out that AIF only says the TOID will often be a text string, not that it has to be. And so we could perhaps think about whether there is a useful CBOR structure that's not a text string that would let us express the relationship between groups and sort of what we've been doing with the wildcarding in the names for the permission coalescing. But that would be in some sense more complicated of an approach than just using a text string, because now we've got two different versions of the identifier that we have to keep track of, we have to process. And so it's convenient in some sense to use a text string for both and just put some underlying substructure in the text string. And if you have some time, maybe think about whether there would be a nice elegant way of doing the group, what we're currently doing with the wildcarding, basically, if there's an elegant way of doing that with a CBOR structure that's not a text string, but I don't know that it's super critical to really look at it in that detail.
Yeah, I also think it's not too critical, hopefully, and for sure it'll get things more complicated. But after some decomposing, possibly, I believe you need to end up to some kind of text string anyway to compare an exact name against the pattern in this particular case. and thinking of other drafts where name were defined all along as text strings already. So group members are already thinking that way at an early discovery, later on during joining and so on. So we'll just keep building on the same track, so to say. And if we diverge, assuming it's convenient in some way, it risks to have to open for rethinking previous steps too. Yeah, unless we see any big gain, probably simple text strings are just good enough.
We would need a pretty big gain to do something else.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Slides.
Yes, I think that there's now a totally different slide set to be loaded because this was concluded.
So, question: do you think you're going to be ready by next IETF with the admin interface?
Well, there may be chances that it considered good enough to approach working group last call. I'm not sure. We can try. It depends how the documents evolve. But ready at most means that, because I mean, we haven't even approached working group last call yet.
So you're not committing to be ready for next IETF.
I plan to produce a revision incorporating all this. Okay, in the best cases, if you judge it ready for working group last call, that can happen. But in case ready means ready for that, not more really.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm done with this presentation. I think there is one more on the revoked token notification document. Yes, thank you, which doesn't have to do with group communication, finally. But just to recap, this is an additional optional feature to support for an authorization server to inform both client and resource servers about tokens that have been issued and they have been revoked but are not yet expired. And it's intended to complement, not to replace at all, the optional token introspection service. But unlike introspection, this is something truly available for both client and resource servers. And the idea is for the authorization server to locally maintain a list of tokens that have been issued, are revoked, but are not expired yet. And both client and resource server can access that resource, possibly observe it using observation for co-op. And by doing so, they can retrieve a list of revoked tokens, but not really all of them, only those pertaining to that exact client and resource server making the request.
So I just have a question. A token also have a deadline, or it has a date after which it's not valid anymore, or
that's expiration. That's
expiration date. Yeah.
Yeah, this is about tokens can be revoked before they come to that point for whatever reason, and it's good to inform the interested parties as soon as possible.
Yeah. So basically, but when you have expiration date, it's not part of the introspection. So you have three mechanisms.
Well, if
this is my understanding.
If you try to introspect an expired token by reference or by value, the authorization server will tell you this token is not valid, and I think you can specify why, and then okay, you delete it. So sure, you can find out that the token is expired, but through introspection is a bit weird because you should know the token expiration from what is defined in the token.
Yeah, exactly. So this is one way. I see 3 ways to manage those. Ask the revocation. I mean, you look at the expiration time, and you have the introspection where you ask what is the status of that token, or and so on.
Well, you know when it expires.
Yeah.
So introspection can be useful to learn in advance if the token has been revoked. If you take the initiative to introspect, of course, that you can do one token at a time. Oh, sorry,
so, sorry to jump in. I guess, Daniel, I would treat the introspection and the expiration information in the token as being basically equivalent. And
Okay.
so if there was a token that had an expiration time, but it got revoked before then, I would still expect that when I go and consult the token introspection, it would just tell me the expiration time of the token. I would not expect introspection to have the additional information about revocation.
Yeah. Okay.
Thanks. So yeah, this was just a high-level recap to get into the topic again. So next slide, please. Yeah, and to add on that, there are different ways for clients and resource server to retrieve this information about revoked tokens from the authorization server. We have right now defined 3 modes of operation. One must be supported by the authorization server. We called it full query. And basically a device, being it client or resource server, doesn't really matter anymore, retrieves all the pertaining tokens that have been revoked. In the diff query, it's not about retrieving indications one by one of all the currently expired, revoked but not expired yet tokens, but rather a list of recent updates performed to that set of revoked token. And the third mode of operation built over suggestions from Ben actually some meetings ago, and using the cursor pattern of the series transfer pattern. It's basically an extension of the second mode that additionally allows for transferring updates in chunks, even starting from a particular indicated resumption point. But details about these modes are in the draft anyway. It was just a bit of context again. Next slide, please. Right, this was recently adopted, basically right after the previous IETF meeting. We received a review on the list from Marco Rasori from CNR, to whom we are very grateful, and is also implementing this draft, building on our implementation for Java Californium. And we submitted a new version, in fact, addressing most of that review. I think we still have an open point and adding more text about underspecified error handling and token processing, other than some editorial improvements. Next slide, please. Yeah, I just wanted to mention the main points from that review and the open point that I have left from it. First of all, we realized we weren't having explicit text about what the client and resource server would do when learning that some pertaining tokens are revoked. So now we are pretty explicit about having to expunge them. And the resource server has to take some additional action, of course. The resource server may learn that an access token it has been revoked. So it should delete it and stop any attempt of access. But it should also remember that that particular access token has been revoked until it expires. And that's necessary in order to prevent the client in bad or good faith or following a delayed behavior to post or repost that token that is not expired but has been revoked. So there's some particular care in all this that the resource server has to take care of, other than the simple fact of deleting the token altogether, of course. This is now in the draft. Next slide, please. Yeah, then there was a lot of improvement to do in terms of error handling, not only about which situations result in an error to be handled and communicated to the requesting device, but we also introduced an actual format for error response messages with mimics, again, the semantics used in the ACE framework, first of all, and then in some of the application profiles. So in case of error, the response returned to the requesting client or resource server uses the same content format we had defined anyway in previous version of the draft. There has to be an integer identifying the error, and optionally a text string giving an error description. And we have come up with a number of error cases that we are already using, and we are registering those. Next slide, please. We should be about, the open point we have. So I presented before the use of the cursor pattern as a third mode of operation, and it is still presented that way in Appendix B since, it was introduced that way. The more we thought about that, the more we realized that, well, it's actually an extension of the second mode, because it is still diff-based, just adding the additional functionality of resuming the update transfer from a certain point in time. So the plan would be to move this content out of Appendix B and to merge it in the document body in the section where the second mode is defined. And there's Christian in the queue.
Hello, Christian. Could you explain whether there is much value to the section 2 to the second mechanism in having it stand alone without the extensions of the third mechanism? So might it not be easier to just go all the way and describe the third mechanism, and or is there a particular use case where the second mechanism without the extensions is really valuable?
Thanks. If you're sure that the authorization server supports the cursor pattern, it just goes for it anyway. And then it works well in case the client resource server supports it or not. So it's mostly to try to be friendly with an authorization server that doesn't want to use it. But for the sake of presentation, yeah, it's a single thing. Totally. So I hope I can capture this well enough in the revision. That was basically the intention. Okay, thanks. Next slide is a detail that follows from this, how to represent payload of responses. And this is the current situation, considering the way we have three distinct modes. Error responses are always CBOR map, fine. The first and second mode are very minimal. That was good enough, that they've always been just a CBOR array in the payload. This currently third mode with the cursor uses a CBOR map instead. So thinking of the changes we want to do and moving the Appendix B content to the document body. Next slide, please. It seems like you may want to have CBOR maps somewhere, sometimes not. This also came from the review we got from Marco that was just proposing, okay, just use CBOR maps and that's it in every response, because probably you're going to need a CBOR map anyway, so just use it in any possible response from any possible mode. So that would work. It's kind of a shortcut. I also discussed more offline with Mark about that, and there can be a middle ground which is more optimal, which is the proposal of the next slide.
You have 2 minutes.
Yes, I can make it. So error responses are and can stay CBOR maps. That's fine. We can define the format for the payload of responses basically depending on what the authorization server supports. So if it supports the use of cursor, basically, well, then all responses will be a CBOR map. Worst case, they will include the cursor information that a client resource server may not understand, but they'll just ignore that information and it doesn't hurt. But if we have an authorization server that doesn't support cursor and would never use that, then we are sure there will never be any use of CBOR maps for successful responses, and we can fall back for CBOR arrays. Personally, I don't see this that complicated if it's phrased well in the document. So as a first attempt, I'll try to propose this text, and then it's probably easier to judge for the group once it is written down. But at least it prevents useless overhead unless you really need it because the authorization server goes for that. This will probably go through a few iterations, of course, before we are all happy enough. But I'll take a first attempt.
Okay, good.
And that's it.
So thank you for presenting.
Thank
And I think we can conclude this meeting. But before, I'd like to ask maybe last time if Ben is willing to say something, or if Paul, our new AD, is willing to say anything.
So, Paul speaking. No, not yet, because well, I'm not yet an AD, and I definitely have to read up on everything that's happening in this group. Ben has been great at giving me a hand up on a lot of things, but I have a lot of reading to catch up on. But I'll reach out to you as chairs to once I'm ready for you.
Okay, sure. Thank you. So I think we're done. Thank you very much.
Which, of course, I have to. When is the next formal telechat? Like next week? Right. So I have a lot of reading to do there. So yeah, I might have to do a few no objections there.
I think it's the 7th.
Yeah, but like